In our study of the Gospel according to Matthew, we have made it to Matthew's final section, the 7th section, which of course is according to my outline for how I've mapped out his Gospel. So we've made it here to the last section of these things. This covers the final 3 chapters of Matthew's Gospel, so Matthew 26, 27, and 28. And in section 7, we see that Jesus, with sovereign humility, is murdered on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins and is resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom, which is a very full summary of what's going on there. But of course, it is the very center of the gospel, so it kind of has to be elaborate. But that's where Matthew has gotten to, finally toward the end of his gospel. Now, of course, I divide these sections into portions because I like things to be nice and neatly outlined. And we're in the first portion of that 7th section. And Matthew spends the first portion of that section showing that Christ is sovereign over his own death. And so basically the idea that Jesus' death wasn't an accident nor something that just kind of was sprung upon him. This was the plan, he was following the plan, and he was in control of that plan. So that's what we've seen there in this first portion. And this first portion comes to a close with the passage in front of us today. And so we're going to be reading Matthew 26, verses 30 through 35 through 35, 5 verses, 6 verses. Anyway, that's where we are. And this passage records Jesus and the disciples leaving their Last Supper together. You might have remembered I had the idea of doing another sermon on the whole Last Supper, Lord's Supper, communion kind of thing. I decided not to do that particular sermon. I'm just going to move on in Matthew. So that brings us to this passage. Let's go ahead and read this passage. This is again Matthew 26, verses 30 through 35. It says, "After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee.' But Peter said to him, 'Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away.' And Jesus said to him, 'Truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.' Peter said to him, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you.' All the disciples said the same thing too." So in this passage, Matthew gives us one last picture of the sovereignty of Jesus before his humiliation by comparing him against his cowardly disciples. And I decided to use that word because at least for tonight the word applies, at least for this night that is, on that very occasion. So we're seeing a contrast here between Jesus and his disciples. What Christ predicts in this passage will come true that very night. The disciples will forsake him when he is arrested, and Peter will deny 3 times that he knows Jesus. These things are going to proceed exactly as Jesus said. And given all that is plainly evident about human nature, this may not be the most amazing prediction ever given by Jesus. He's given a few by this point, and of course, Jesus, his ability to predict these things is a further show of his sovereignty and his lordship. But this one in particular, not so impressive. I mean, you kind of expect people to flee when danger comes in and all that sort of thing. In this case, the sovereignty of Christ is seen not in his ability to predict the future, but in his ability to face certain death all alone and knowing that he will be alone. His sovereignty is shown in his ability to endure that deliberately and do so in the way that he does. And Jesus faces that lonely death not with a stoic despair, but with all the confidence of someone who expects to walk out of his tomb and reunite with his disciples in Galilee, as he also says here. So, there's more than one way to face certain death, and Jesus does it in a way that is quite beyond what a normal person would be able to do. And for all those reasons, I consider this passage the finale of Matthew's efforts to portray Christ as sovereign over his own death. We've been kind of plugging away at this portion of Matthew and this idea for a while, but I think here this is kind of the last note where Matthew is very deliberately honing in on that idea of Christ as sovereign over his own death. My outline today for my sermon has 3 headings, so I'll give those to you so you know where we're going in the rest of this sermon. First, Christ shows his sovereignty through the failing and regathering of his disciples. And I guess you could say the failing is more of a prerequisite to the regathering, but Christ shows his sovereignty through those events that are going to play out with the disciples here before too long. Secondly, Christ shows his sovereignty through Zechariah's picture of him as the irreplaceable shepherd of his flock. And I found it very challenging to choose a word to encapsulate all that I was trying to say in that. I settled on irreplaceable. You'll see what I mean by that when I get there. And then thirdly, Christ shows his sovereignty through amassing a kingdom of cowards. And here I'm again referring to the disciples in not very flattering terms, but in terms which I think are actually very useful and important, calling them a kingdom of cowards. And for all those reasons, which I've set forth in my outline, I'm entitling today's sermon, The Kingdom of Cowards. Like I'm very much focusing on the failing of the disciples at this point, but its greater implications for the kingdom of God. On the one hand, this description of God's kingdom will be refuted about 50 days from this day when all the disciples lay aside their fear. 50 days from now, from this point of things, on the day of Pentecost, we're going to see a very different group of disciples beginning their work as apostles. And so everything I'm saying today will be somewhat refuted at that time. But for now, they are cowards who seek only to save themselves. And that will unfold as chapter 26 of Matthew goes on. So in some degree, the word coward very much applies. And for that, I am truly thankful. I think we should all be thankful. Although the Bible has mighty condemnations of fearing anything but God himself, it also gives hope to fearful people that even they can lay aside that fear and serve the kingdom of God faithfully. And that, of course, is if you want to call it this, after so many movies that we have seen, this is the redemption arc of the 12 disciples, or at least 11 of them, right? They actually come through all of this and become very different men. And that is the ultimate message of Scripture, and today we'll see some of that. We'll at least see the beginning of it. So that is the plan for my sermon today. So let's go ahead and get into the meat of things with the first heading that I gave you. As I said, Christ shows his sovereignty through the failing and regathering of his disciples. And in this, I am mostly just hitting some of the high points of the passage. There's a lot to go through with this, but just to kind of skip along the mountaintops here. As the passage begins, we see the basic theme of this passage in that prediction from Jesus that all the disciples will fall away from him that night. Something strange thing just to straight up and tell somebody, you're all going to abandon me tonight, in fact, when they probably weren't even thinking along those lines. It's worth mentioning that all 4 Gospels record some passage like this. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have something about Jesus telling them that they're all going to forsake him that night. In this case, if all 4 Gospels record this about the disciples, it means the cowardice of the disciples is how all Christians are meant to think about these men at this time in their lives. I often do put a lot of emphasis on things that we find in all 4 of the Gospels, since they all can be somewhat different from each other. Anytime they all zero in on one thing and say it much the same way, you know you're dealing with a major theme. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John want us to view these men as cowards in some degree, which is all the more amazing since 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and John, were written by some of these men. It's like, hey, we just want you to know I was a big coward that night, and don't you forget it. It's an article of faith. They actually just want you to know that. But also, if all four Gospels record this, then we know it reflects something about how all Christians are meant to think of Jesus. Someone who knows he will have no human help at his time of deepest distress, but still moves forward. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, again, want you to be very much aware that this is Jesus. This is someone who keeps moving ahead, serving God and following the plan, even if there's nobody with him, even men that have been his, very much his closest friends and associates for a long time. So this then belongs to the most important layer of the gospel story, something that all four Gospels record here in this last part of the gospel story when they're really coming to the substance of the gospel. The story of the death and resurrection of Jesus to save us from our sins includes this idea, then, of Jesus kind of trucking through all of this by himself without any human help, knowing that he would do it all alone and still doing it anyway. So all of that is worth noticing as we come to this passage. Of course, even when all four Gospels record the same thing, they have to do it differently, or else it would be too easy for us. And I always say I like to deal with these kinds of things whenever we're comparing the four Gospels, and whenever they do have somewhat different details, I like to deal with these things. I feel like there's usually meat there, something for us to chew on. So I want to do that here too. We see that Matthew records this conversation while they are on their way to the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper. They finish up the Last Supper, First Communion meal. They get up to leave, and as they're walking to this Garden of Gethsemane where they're going, Jesus tells them that they're all going to fall away because of him. And Mark does exactly what Matthew does. If you were to flip over to Mark's Gospel and compare, they are very similar. A few differences. We'll talk about those later. But Matthew and Mark, mostly the same. However, as for Luke and John, they record this conversation during the Last Supper. So part of the scene there at the table where Jesus is like dropping bombshells of all sorts on them that night, and this is one of them right there at that time. So I guess you could say, Luke and John put this event like a half an hour earlier or something. Who knows what the exact timetable was that evening, but a little bit earlier than Mark and Matthew would say. Now, moving stories around in the timeline of events is actually very common, not only among the four Gospels, but in the biographies of that time and place. I did spend a little bit of time talking to you about that not too long ago, about how you go to the Greek and Roman biographers, they're doing the same kind of thing, just kind of shuffling events around of the people they're recording. And the four Gospels do that on numerous occasions. It's nothing new. However, usually that's done for a reason. The classical authors did that for a reason. And as we've discovered, as we've had a lot of conversations like this one, the four Gospels are usually also doing that for some kind of reason. And it's always worthwhile to ask why. Why move things around the way you do? Well, in this case, I observed that only Matthew and Mark include the quotation from Zechariah about striking the shepherd, which I also read to you as part of this passage earlier. Luke and John don't record that quotation from Zechariah and Jesus' application of it. Only Matthew and Mark do. It's unique to their Gospels. And if that quotation happened on the road to the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane, then perhaps that is why Matthew and Mark just moved Jesus' prediction about the falling away of the apostles to that same place. Because after all, they are connected. We see here, basically, he tells them what they're going to do based on the scripture that he read. So they are connected to some degree. And so it makes sense for Matthew and Mark, if they're going to include the Zechariah quotation, to also put it there. Now, if you're Luke or John and you're not recording the Zechariah quotation for whatever reason, you don't really have to bind them together all that closely, and you have a little more liberty on where you record things. It could be also that, Jesus told the apostles there at the Last Supper, you're going to fall away this night because of me. And as they're on the road walking, one of them kind of taps Jesus on the shoulder and said, hey, that thing you said, why did you say that? And Jesus says, well, Zechariah predicted this. And you can kind of see it being a follow-up to a previous statement. Any number of things could have happened here. I'm just throwing ideas out just so If any of you are comparing these things and wonder why they're a little bit different, you have some options for what to think. But one way or another, we see the basic theme of this passage in this prediction that the disciples will fall away from Jesus that night. This is the main theme, and it very much is front and center here. But Jesus did not leave the matter there, even though that is kind of the front-loaded thought here of the passage. Christ also tells the disciples that he will meet them again in Galilee. And this here, in case you missed it, because it is very brief and kind of gets swallowed up in the middle of all these other things. But Matthew 26:32 says this, "But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Ahead of you into Galilee. Now, that is, of course, a reference to his resurrection, after I have been raised, and that's nothing new. Jesus predicting that he's going to be raised from the dead. Christ has told his disciples a few times now that he will rise from the dead, even though they did not understand him. It seems like that really didn't penetrate the brains of the disciples too well, and they probably thought it was some other kind of parable, like he very often tells. But nonetheless, Jesus has told them that before. But here's a new detail, that Christ was planning on reuniting with his disciples after his resurrection. This is a brand new detail about them getting together afterward. Now, the disciples themselves seem to have missed all of this, fixating on the reference to them falling away, right? I mean, they're like, hey, I don't think that's true, Jesus. I would never do that to you. And Peter, of course, is more vocal about that. They just want to proclaim their loyalty over and against what Jesus just told them. But for our part, as we're sitting here 2,000 years later, reflecting on these things sober-mindedly, we can make a few observations, 3 observations from what Christ has just told these men. First, Jesus has been consistently certain that he will rise from the dead. And this is kind of the latest installment. He's been telling them this in Matthew's gospel since chapter 16. And there are maybe a few hints even before that. But from chapter 16 onward, he's been telling them this often. So he is consistently certain that he will rise from the dead. It's not a passing fancy that he has. Secondly, Christ is so confident in his resurrection, he is already making plans for the immediate aftermath. He is so sure that death will not hold him down that his to-do list extends beyond death. I mean, imagine if your to-do list was something like, okay, Thursday, I need to go shopping. Friday, I will die. And then Saturday, I will mow the yard. Like, there's something wrong with the order there. Good to keep things in order before your death, but I mean, usually that doesn't happen in that order. But that is the kind of to-do list which Christ has written for himself. He's going to die, going to rise from the dead, and he is going to reunite with these men in Galilee. And finally, and most importantly, third observation, especially for the disciples, Christ is already planning to regain and restore his cowardly flock. He is already thinking ahead of their failure into what to do next for them. Now, if any friend of yours were to abandon you in your time of greatest need, you may indeed want nothing more to do with that person. You might say that would be a very natural reaction to the hurt and the shame and the anger that you would feel in that moment. And even if you calmed your anger toward that person, you might have no strong desire to see that person again. And that's also a very common thing that people would experience in dealing with these kinds of very personal failures, these personal betrayals, we might call them. But as for Jesus, the very first item on his to-do list after conquering death is to meet and greet the people who entirely failed him. The ones that should have been there for him, who were not there for him. He's going to be there for them, like immediately after he rises from the dead. It's the first item on his list. And I have included this under a discussion of the sovereignty of Christ because we see here a man who truly believes he can do anything. He is very much of the mind that nothing is going to stop any of his purposes. He can rise from the dead, and he can build a kingdom with such worthless men as are standing before him at that moment. Even though he knows the caliber of these men and knows that they're not really going to hold up under the pressure that's about to fall, he can still use those guys. And he's so sure of that, he's going to make the effort to go get them afterward. and regather the flock. So truly nothing is beyond the power of Christ at this point. He is entirely sovereign, not just over his death, but over what's going to happen after his death. And in all of this, he shows his sovereignty then through the failing and regathering of his disciples. Through the failures of those men, we can see another glimpse into just how in control Christ is of all things. And that is the point of my first heading in this sermon. Now, as we move on to my second heading, Christ shows his sovereignty through Zechariah's picture of him as the irreplaceable shepherd of his flock. And again, I had some trouble choosing a word for that, but I settled on irreplaceable. I trust you will somehow agree with that, but I need to explain what I mean by that. So now we're talking about Zechariah and this prediction quoted by Jesus. Now, for those of you who like to compare the New Testament with the Old Testament whenever one quotes the other, I want to make a few comments on how Matthew quotes this passage. And here I'm going to flip back to Zechariah 13. If you all want to go there as well, you can. We will be somewhat there, for a little bit. So if you do want to go to Zechariah 13, verses 7 through 9, we're going to read a little bit more than what Jesus quotes, or at least more than what Matthew records. So Zechariah 13, verse 7, I'm going to read through verse 9. So for those of you that need a little help finding your way, the Old Testament ends with Malachi. Turn back one book, and you're in Zechariah. And Zechariah 13 is right there toward the end. So Zechariah 13, verses 7 through 9. So, I think Jesus quotes maybe, a few lines from verse 7. We're going to read verses 7, 8, and 9. So it says this: "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. It'll come about in all the land, declares the Lord, that 2 parts of it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it. And I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. And they will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people. And they will say, the Lord is my God." Now, if you compare Zechariah and Matthew, you won't see many differences between the original and the quotation. They are very, very close in terms of wording. In fact, this is one of those few occasions when a New Testament author, writing in Greek, because again the New Testament was written primarily in Greek, when a New Testament author does not quote the Greek version of the Old Testament that the Jews very often used at this time, the Septuagint translation. Normally, that's what the New Testament author will do. They will quote that translation because, hey, they're writing in Greek, they've translated the Old Testament into Greek, might as well just use that. Matthew does not do that in this case. He actually sticks with what appears to be, perhaps, just his own fresh translation of the Hebrew into Greek, which keeps it very, very close to what Zechariah wrote in Hebrew. So there's not a whole lot of variation there. Even the kind of variation that you might come to expect from that kind of quotation of an ancient translation and all of that. The only difference you might see is the very beginning, and that is the way Matthew begins it. The way Matthew records it, he says, "I will strike the shepherd." If you go back to Matthew 26 and look at that, that's how he begins the prediction. I will strike the shepherd, meaning that God will strike him. The I there is God saying what he is going to do. However, if you go back to Zechariah and compare, you see that it's just a command. The command is strike the shepherd, right? That's how Zechariah records it. The thing is, though, in Zechariah, as you can see by turning there, that is a command issued by God to God's own sword. So it's God talking to his sword, which means God is still the one striking the shepherd. So if anything, Matthew just kind of condenses it into a simple statement, I will strike the shepherd. Makes sense for a paraphrase, if you will, of Zechariah's actual statement there. So not a whole lot of change at all, definitely not a change in meaning. If anything, Matthew just makes God's plan more clear, that it is his plan for all of this to happen, and Christ is following that plan as always. God will strike the shepherd. That shepherd is Christ. Jesus knows this. He's on board with it, and he's going through with it. But now we must ask whether Jesus understands the prophecy correctly. And of course, I'm going to say he does, but whenever we're dealing with these kinds of things, it's helpful to get back into the thought process and see what the reasoning might be, because that might help us understand the original passage much better. So naturally, Jesus understands the shepherd as the Messiah, and everything else is the aftermath of the Messiah's death. Right? So this is, of course, why would it be any different? Of course, Jesus understands the shepherd to be him, the Christ, the Messiah. If we look at the details in Zechariah, I think that is the correct interpretation. I think we can see that by just studying it as though we were coming to it fresh. The shepherd being struck is called God's associate, or the man who stands next to God. So he is someone who is like on God's side. He is with God. So we can suppose that this shepherd is actually someone who serves God. Like this is a godly shepherd, whoever or whatever he is. Also, it's worth remembering that the image of a shepherd is most often applied to kings in the Old Testament. This is just some of your maybe backstage knowledge here. Anytime you see a word like rule or something like that, very often that is actually a translation of the Hebrew word for shepherd. Like they literally use that word to talk of the act of governing. Just to give you, just to give you one example of that, I will briefly turn to 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. You don't have to go there. I just want to read it as an example for you, because in this case, it actually gets translated as shepherd, so you can actually see it. This is from, the life of David. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people, Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. Then they anointed David king over Israel. So just an example there to you of this use of shepherding as a kind of image of kingship. So based on that, we have every reason to think that the shepherd of Zechariah 13 is a godly king. The shepherd is someone who is God's associate, and shepherds are very often kings in biblical imagery. So there you go, a godly king, right? And yet, to our shock, God's plan is to strike down that godly king to terrible effect for everyone else. He's not just striking down this godly king, but afterward there's like this, basically 2/3 of everybody die in the way that's worded there, and then 1/3 gets purified. So honestly, we can say in the whole history of Israel, we have not seen God deal with a godly king in that way. Usually in Israel's history, what you see, if there is a godly king, God prospers that king as a reward for actually obeying him. Whereas it's the ungodly kings, it's the wicked ones that usually get just pummeled by God in some way. But here we've got the godly king being struck down. And that means Zechariah is most certainly talking about a future godly king. If nothing like this happened at all in Israel's history, then it's got to be Israel's future. It has to be a future godly king. And once you start predicting a future godly king, you are talking about the Messiah. I mean, this is very conspicuous throughout the Old Testament prophets. I mean, their view of the future pretty much always includes this future godly king. I mean, this is the Messiah. Therefore, Christ is correct in the way he understands this passage, applying it to himself as the Messiah. So, in case any of you had any doubts, yes, Jesus is correct in that. But of course, this passage does more than predict the death of the Messiah. Zechariah goes on for far longer than what Matthew quotes. Zechariah also predicts a purging of the people. Just to read the passage again, it says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man, my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. It'll come about in all the land, declares the Lord, that 2 parts in it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it. And I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. Then they will call on my name, and I will answer them. And I will say, they are my people. And they will say, the Lord is my God. Now, Zechariah describes what appears to be a slaughter of 2/3 of the people. Not a good aftermath of the striking of this shepherd. Now, even though Jesus provides no interpretation for that, we can guess what he would have said based on what he did say, because it's not as though Jesus hasn't given any other predictions about what's going to happen after his ministry. Jesus actually has said a lot about that, especially as of late in Matthew's gospel in the chapters leading up to where we are. Christ has by now repeatedly taught that the upcoming Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire and its deadly consequences would be the immediate effect of his murder, because about 4 decades after Jesus, the Jews are in full revolt against the Roman Empire, and they destroyed themselves pretty badly before the Romans even got there. But then the Romans come and just squash them, and it's just horrifically bad there at Jerusalem. We talked about all this in earlier stages of the Matthew study. Jesus has talked about that and has implied very strongly that this is actually the result of him being crucified. This is the punishment of God on them for that. And since the death toll of that war would be so great, we can easily view it as the fulfillment of Zechariah's words when he says that like 2/3 of them are going to perish. Well, that is not far off from what we see during that phase of revolt against the Jews. I mean, Jerusalem was basically just one huge massacre by the end of that war. Now, we know that God's ultimate plan was for Israel to reject their Messiah and for Jesus to die. We can know that standing back, putting all the pieces together, that this is exactly what God intended to happen. Like, this was the plan. They were, in some sense, supposed to reject him. However, if Israel had actually accepted him in all the right ways as their king, the next few decades would not have gone as badly as they did for Israel. And I have no idea how that would look from a redemptive historical plan kind of thing, but just thinking of the hypothetical, there would have been no massive judgment on Jerusalem at that time if they had not crucified their Messiah. All right, so we can honestly say, if this, then that, with regard to these things. So in that way, the striking of the shepherd led to a very bloody aftermath for the nation of Israel. And given 4 decades, and yes, that's exactly what happened for the nation. But if that is the case, we have our first clue about the 1/3 of the people who escape slaughter and are purified to be the people of God. As Zechariah says, I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested, and they will call on my name, and I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. We actually have a clue for who this 1/3 is based on the 2/3 and how Jesus would likely interpret that. We have already seen, also in Matthew chapter 24, that anyone who believes the words of Christ would get out of Jerusalem and away from the slaughter when they see the abomination of desolation. Again, we talked about all this back in 24. Jesus gave them kind of a cryptic sign, but said, when you see this, get out. Get out of Jerusalem. And of course, if you're a Christian and you believe the words of Jesus, you're going to obey him, and you're going to escape all of that. And we know from church history that there were Christians that got out of there before things got really, really bad. So that warning would spare a good number of Jewish Christians. And of course, there were Jewish Christians. These disciples, there with Jesus, are the first generation of the Jewish church. And there were many more of them. And, they're going to reap the benefits of that when things start to come unglued there in Israel, when the Romans come in to finish off the rebellion that's in there. Of course, these faithful Jews are going to be spared all of that, which again falls in line with this thing that Zechariah says. Now, I've taken you through all of that to make the point that Jesus was making, which Zechariah also made, and that is that Christ is very much the irreplaceable shepherd of his flock. And I finally get to explain why I chose that word. So the death of Jesus accomplished God's plan for the redemption of sinners, but his death also destabilized an entire region of the world and put the faithful on a very difficult road to purity. right? That is what happened. Like the next thing after the ministry of Christ, you just see the political situation there in Israel just absolutely erode until Jews are killing each other, and then the Romans come in and kill off the survivors, and the Christians got out, but of course they're Christians, so they're being persecuted like everywhere and throughout that whole time. So all very difficult. You can't imagine, again, this is a what if, and you have no idea how other parts of God's plan would work out if this had happened. But again, if Jesus had been accepted rightfully as their king, if they had believed in him as they should have, you can't see history unfolding in exactly that way. I don't know what God would do, but it would be better off in an earthly sense of speaking for Israel and for believers in Jesus. I mean, you can't see it going as horribly as it did. But man, kill off Jesus and everything just goes to pieces. And it did. That's why I call him the irreplaceable shepherd. I mean, it's like you're playing Jenga, right? And you've got some of these pieces taken off, but you remove the one that you should not have removed, and it just all falls over. It's like the one piece that was absolutely needed to hold this thing together, that's gone, and it all comes apart. That's why I call him irreplaceable. Without Christ, I mean, just like the next step for Israel wasn't good. And really, I mean, you think about the past 2,000 years, it hasn't really been good for them since then either. Terrible to say, but very much true historically. So that, I think, is kind of an indirect argument for the sovereignty of Christ. He is so essential, you can't do without him. Taking him out, even briefly, even for 3 days, the repercussions are enormous. And of course, this kind of thing should lead to us praying for his return as speedily as possible. So I do hope that in your prayers you are praying for the return of Christ, because there's a lot of problems that need fixing, and he's the only one that can fix them. Well, that was the middle part of my sermon. I got one more thing to cover here. Let's finally talk about how Christ shows his sovereignty through amassing a kingdom of cowards. So coming back to what I consider to be the leading idea and the title of my sermon, this kingdom of cowards. I've been building to this point, but I have not yet talked about the disciples themselves and their cowardice on this particular night. I think there's some detail here that is worth talking about, just really getting inside their heads and understanding the situation. Now, amazingly, Jesus portrays the failure of the disciples as more emotional than physical. And that might be a very strange thing to say, and you might not have ever thought of it that way. I certainly did not till I sat down with this and said, what am I going to preach on this passage? But thinking about it, it's more of an emotional failure than a physical one. As we think of it, we might expect that the disciples would foremost have the fear of punishment and death on their minds. I mean, we would think maybe just as we casually are reading this and thinking, what if I were there? We might think that punishment and death would be the foremost danger that we could see. After all, Christ has been talking about crucifixion and being put to death and all these kind of rosy things. And you would think that, even if the disciples don't fully understand all of that, it can't be anything good. Even if this is some kind of weird parable that Jesus has been saying all this time, it doesn't sound like a nice parable. And so maybe we need to get out of here and save our skins, that kind of thing. You can see maybe how that might be your initial thought as you read the passage. And yet, Jesus frames the failure of the disciples using a very specific word, or in most English translations, a phrase, falling away. A very specific wording here. You will all fall away this night because of me. Now, the word used here, going to the Greek that was actually written here, the word is skandalizo. And if that sounds remotely familiar to you, it's because we actually get our word scandal, or scandalous, or scandalize from that word. And it's not that far off from what the Greek word means. Usually in the New Testament, it's translated as being offended. So something that just kind of like afflicts you at this deep emotional level, just kind of hits you like that. You're offended, you're scandalized by this thing that you saw or that someone did to you. Therefore, the way Jesus portrays the disciples, they're not so much afraid of torture and death, but they are offended, if you will, at how this is going to go. They're going to fall away. They're going to be scandalized by all of this. Now, to emphasize this, give me some time to make this point, but to emphasize this, Matthew includes a few words that Mark does not include in his account. Remember how I said that Mark and Matthew were very similar but not identical? Well, Matthew includes a few things here that I think help us out. And those words are, because of me, or as Peter says, because of you, right? So Jesus tells them that they will fall away because of me. Like that's his wording there. In other words, Christ will take this failure personally because they're falling away because of him. It has to do with you. It's you, Jesus. The problem is not me, it's you. Like that's how they're thinking of it. And likewise, Peter objects that he will not fall away because of you. He says, oh, no. You got it all wrong, Jesus. I'm with you. Like, you're my God. I'm going to stay with you. Like, he's not going to do this. Of course, Peter will fall away, but he doesn't know that yet. Now, again, the disciples are not then portrayed as abandoning Christ out of a sense of self-preservation, but out of a sense of scandal at being with a man like Jesus. Like, they're going to be offended to be there in his presence when all this stuff goes down. Now, if you have any doubt about what I'm saying, I will also say that Peter is about to swing a sword at one of the people arresting Jesus. Like, this is something that he is going to do. Matthew even records this, and it shows up in a couple of the other Gospels too. I mean, Peter at least makes it very clear he is not afraid to die. Like, he's not afraid to get into a tussle. Like, if the other guy pulls out a sword, I'll cut off his hand after cutting off his ear. I mean, like, Peter is down for a fight. Okay, he is ready to go in there and fight. But the idea of giving up without a fight, he can't take that, and the others can't either. And once it becomes clear as things progress that Jesus is not going to lift a finger to stop this, that's when they run. Like, that is actually how it goes down. The idea of giving up without a fight is apparently the limit of their loyalty. It is the as far as their faithfulness can go. Now, having said all that, it's time to address the kind of double-sided message of Christ about this kind of cowardice. Because there are two things worth saying about all of this, and it's worth saying both here together. Now, earlier in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 10, Jesus made some very specific comments on this kind of thing. They're very relevant for talking about Peter's denials especially, but the falling away of the other disciples as well. Just to quote briefly then from Matthew chapter 10, you don't necessarily have to turn there, but Matthew 10 verses 32 and 33, we see this. Therefore, everyone who confesses me before men, I will also, excuse me, everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. So Jesus has commented on this kind of thing before. Now, based on that, we might say that the disciples have utterly and totally failed to the point of condemnation. Especially Peter, who does straight up deny him more than once in one night, but all the rest of them, hightailed it out of there as well. So, they're all kind of under this condemnation, you might think. After all, they will flee, just as Jesus said. And just to read that part, because I haven't read it yet. Going back to Matthew 26, verses 55, 56, at this time, Jesus said, let's back up. Let's back up and let's see Peter do what I said he did. Let's back up to verse 51. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached out and drew out his sword, and we know from other passages that's Peter. Therefore, the one who was with Jesus reached out and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said, put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way? At that time Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching you, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Then all the disciples left him and fled. So that's how it goes down, and of course, with Peter, the story continues with his actual denials. Now, this failure is great. I mean, we've been talking about that all this time. This is a great failure on the part of the disciples, and it's twice as bad for Peter, who would indeed deny 3 times that night that he even knew Jesus. And yet, despite these glaring failures, apparently sealing the condemnation of all these men, Christ has already promised to reunite with them in Galilee. Like, he wants to see them after this is all over. And we know how those meetings go, and we know how the rest of church history goes. So it's apparently not a catastrophic failure. After all Jesus has said, Jesus is going to reunite with them. And from that point onward, the disciples would be brand new men. They never really act like this again for the rest of their lives. Most of the disciples would even die for their testimony about Christ after enduring years of scorn for preaching the gospel. They are going to become the exact kind of men that Jesus wanted them to be. And this is what I mean by the double-sided message of Christ about this kind of cowardice. There's 2 sides of this that you have to take them both in equal measure and not forget one of them. Truly, someone who has never displayed any boldness in standing for Christ will be denied by Jesus in the end. That passage I read from Matthew 10 means something. And if you get uncomfortable reading that, there's probably a reason you're uncomfortable reading that. And you have to give that its place. But it is equally true that this kind of courage, as with all things, is a matter of growth. It is something you have to grow into as part of the Christian life. And growth takes time. No tree just springs up out of the ground fully formed. It takes a while. Not for no reason does the Bible use the expression oaks of righteousness sometimes to talk about the people of God. Right? It takes time to grow up to be that mighty oak of righteousness. Now, what's more than all that, Christ is willing to wait for that growth. He's actually willing to invest himself in people who right now are not really worth it, but who later will be everything he wants them to be. Again, let's go back to Zechariah just for a moment here, because there's a part of this I haven't talked about yet. At some point in his life, Jesus read the book of Zechariah, or heard it read, and was contemplating that, and was contemplating the words, "The sheep will be scattered." Right? I didn't talk about this part of Zechariah's prediction yet, but Matthew quotes this when Jesus quotes it there in Matthew. The sheep will be scattered. And at some point, Jesus had to ask himself, what does that mean? Given that the scattering of the sheep happens after the striking of the shepherd, but before the purging mentioned later, he evidently concluded that the scattering must refer to some kind of desperate crisis that his followers would face and face poorly. Like, just given the timeline of how Zechariah lays things out and what the other parts of the passage mean, it pretty much has to be that, some kind of immediate crisis that results from the striking of that shepherd. And of course, lining it up with actual history, we know what that is because we see it unfold in Matthew's gospel. And we see it unfold in the other gospels too. So kind of a bleak prophecy. It's like, oh man, when the shepherd is struck, everyone's going to leave me. But of course, Jesus knew prophecy well enough to know that his kingdom could not be thwarted, not even by the kingdom itself. Not even by the people that are going to form the very first generation of this kingdom of God. Even they can't stop the kingdom. Jesus knows prophecy well enough to know this is what God is doing. This is the kingdom that's going to be the last great kingdom of all time, the kingdom that can never be shaken. Therefore, at some point, Jesus embraced this as part of the kingdom. He embraced the kingdom of cowards as part of the plan. They might scatter like sheep, but they're my sheep, and they're going to be my sheep, and they're going to do more in the end than they did at the beginning, and it's going to be okay. And why would Jesus not embrace that weakness in humanity? Why not? He himself is becoming human and feeling that weakness, so he can't really throw too many stones, if you want to put it that way. He himself knows what it's like to have those kind of human emotions of fear and revulsion and being scandalized and all of that. He, of course, doesn't succumb to any of those temptations, but he does feel that, and he has to overcome that. And this, of course, is how he can be a sympathetic high priest and deal with us in our weaknesses. So Jesus is quite willing to embrace these things as part of his mission. And in the end, of course, the weaknesses of his people could only prove that their power came from somewhere else. Like, hey, how did these cowardly men who ran and left Jesus on this day become the men that turned the world upside down in the following years? Like, to use another biblical expression. Like, how did that happen? Where did they get their boldness? Where did they get their words? Well, you have to locate it in somebody else other than them. It's clear in their natural state they're cowards. Somehow they're not now. So what happened? Well, Jesus happened. Like, that just goes all the more to show his own greatness in these situations. It proves him to be, again, the irreplaceable king of this kingdom. He has to be there or else nothing happens. Nothing changes. People don't grow. But with him, yeah, all things are possible. And these men become more than the cowards they were. And as for this momentary lapse of courage, Jesus knew that years of teaching and his own example and the revelation of his own indestructible life would sweep away all of that cowardice eventually. He knew this was not going to be the permanent state of his disciples. He knew they were going to grow beyond this and become different and better men and faithful apostles of the kingdom. But in the meantime, Jesus would patiently bear the burden alone. He is willing to get arrested in that garden with no one to help him and just go through everything by himself. But what better way, of course, to show his patience, his faith, and his own courage than to show it when no one else was there to help? It'd be a terrible thing to endure, an impressive thing to endure it well, but even more impressive if there is literally no one there to help you. And even God has forsaken you, as Jesus himself would imply later in one of his statements from the cross. If the measure of a man is how well he endures suffering, then Christ will show himself to be the King of men. And he'll do it because there was no one there to help him out whenever it came down to it. So in a sense, we can be thankful that those disciples fell away and left him by himself, because we just get to see more of that glory of Christ coming through that situation. Well, let's review. We've made it to the end. Let's review what we've seen so far. So I kind of handled this passage today in three headings. I said, first of all, Christ shows his sovereignty through the failing and regathering of his disciples. So not just the fact that they're going to fall away, but also his plan to reunite with them in Galilee. Like, all of this is a display of how in control he is, even of this very bleak part of the situation. Secondly, Christ shows his sovereignty through Zechariah's picture of him as the irreplaceable shepherd of his flock. And of course, here we went back to Zechariah. We kind of decoded the prophecy, starting with what Jesus says about it, and just sees how without Jesus, things are going to really fall apart for the nation of Israel when they strike down the shepherd. According to God's plan, yes, but still terrible for them. And then finally, Christ shows his sovereignty through amassing a kingdom of cowards. So here talking about the disciples and their failure, yes, but also how dynamic that situation is and what Jesus was hoping and how much we can take encouragement from that, knowing that Jesus intends to grow us beyond any cowardliness we might have and turn us into someone who can actually be servants of his kingdom and do it well. Well, given all of that, these truths represent for us both an encouragement and a duty. There's two sides here. Again, I said it was a double-sided message, so you have to cover both. The encouragement is that Christ is patient with our failings. He was patient with those men, who had basically no excuse after all they have seen and all they have enjoyed in the presence of Christ. They had no excuse to fall away like they did, but you know what? Jesus had compassion on them and very much wanted to make them part of the kingdom anyway, and did so. So we can take encouragement from that, just looking at those kinds of things. But the duty is to grow into the kind of person who will honor Christ as the great king he is, and not always leave him with the kingdom of cowards. So there is some responsibility here to make sure that we are growing likewise, and that we can kind of trace the same character growth, if you want to call it that, of the disciples, and actually grow into being the kind of men they were as we stand for Christ and be bold for him, especially as the world around us gets more and more hostile. Well, next time, whenever I preach next time, probably a few weeks from now actually, we're going to move into the second portion of Matthew's final section. So we're advancing in the outline as I've laid it out. And that'll take us to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is, of course, where Jesus and his disciples were going in this passage. They're kind of in transit in today's passage. Specifically, my plan is to talk about the cup that Jesus mentions in his prayers that he makes to God there before his arrest, and try to figure out what he means by that and what it means for us. So that'll be what I talk on next time I preach. Are there comments that anyone has or questions anyone wants to ask about today's passage?